Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome into Tiered Wide Receiver Trading. I'm Todd Halverson at Dynasty SFlex on Twitter. We're talking Dynasty trades involving wide receivers tiering up, tiering down, and trading within tiers while using consensus ranks from Keep Trade Cut and Fantasy Calc. Last week, we looked at tiers 1, 2, and 3, which was the top 10 wide receivers. You can check that on the pod feed. It's only 9 minutes, and I think it's all still pretty applicable. This week, we're looking at tiers 4 and 5, which is wide receivers 11 through 24-ish. So let me start by just recapping the first 3 tiers from last week. Now, remember, these are consensus tiers using KTC and Fantasy Calc. These are not my ranks, just my interpretation of the tiers from those ranking systems. So tier 1 was Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. Tier 2 is A.J. Brown and ARSB. And Lamb was in a mini tier behind them, but after last week's performance, you can see that he's moved into tier 2. Tyreek's also in this tier as an elite contender piece, but you could sort of call him like tier 2.5. Garrett Wilson, Waddle, Olave, Puka, and Diggs make up tier 3. I will say that Garrett Wilson has started to separate himself, as you can tell in the rankings. So that rounds up the top 10. The big mover this week was Puka, who fell out of this tier 3, and he's going to be found in tier 4, which we'll talk about today. So last week's trade recommendations are all still fairly applicable. All right, let's jump into tier 4, and you'll notice that the tiers are starting to get a little bit larger, which is good. So tier 4, starting with wide receiver 11, we've got Jordan Addison, Puka, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, and Brandon Ayuk. 5 guys. We talked a little last week about how I'd be happy to trade out of tier 3 and back into this tier and get either Brandon Ayuk or Devontae Smith with a nice little plus. Would guess the best you can do is add a second, and I really wouldn't want somebody's dusty old late second, but something in the early to mid would be nice if you're tiering back. We talked to David Katiri in episode 1.08 of the Dynasty Market Watch podcast, and he was a huge advocate of trying to tier down and just getting some draft capital as a plus. So maybe you trade Jalen Waddle and you get T. Higgins and a second, or maybe the equivalent to a second. So someone like Jaden Reed or Treylon Burks. Now, we're talking T, and he's had a rough start to the season, which has created this buy window. And it sounds like he's going to miss this week and maybe another one on top of that at the time of this recording. So if you're a tank team, I love this move even more because you're going to be minimizing your possible points. So that was tearing down from Waddle or Olave to T and getting a second on top. And with the injury, you might actually be able to get more. I wouldn't be too thrilled doing the opposite, though, trying to trade up a tier, adding something on top of Addison, Puka, T, Devontae, or Ayuk, just to land Waddle or Olave from tier 3. Any given week, a big game from these guys, and they could find themselves in tier 3 alongside Waddle and Olave. Heck, just last week, Puka was in tier 3, and now he's in tier 4. So for me, these 2 tiers are pretty similar, but the market doesn't reflect that. I kind of view it as more of a larger tier altogether. So I'd rather just have the guy at the end of tier 4 and get a second on top. As I mentioned earlier, Garrett Wilson is starting to separate himself a bit. He's tied for first in the NFL in target share alongside Tyreek Hill at 33%. He's third in air yard share. That gives him a weighted opportunity rating, which most refer to as WOPR, which is WOPR. He's first in the NFL. So WOPR just uses a formula to combine target share and air yard share. So it represents how a player is dominating the volume within their own team. Garrett Wilson's a tier 2 talent, maybe even tier 1, but the situation is really limiting him, and the market is taking that into consideration. So I wouldn't be opposed to adding a second and going from tier 4 to get to Garrett Wilson. All right, kind of got off topic there. Let's recap tier 4 really quick. So 5 guys: Addison, Puka, Devontae, T, and Ayuk. So I wouldn't be opposed to adding a second to any of those guys to get Garrett Wilson, who's basically a QB away from tier 2. So what about trading from tier 4 all the way up to tier 2? So AJB, Amon-Ra, Lamb. I'd say it's probably a little too pricey for me. I would guess it requires every bit of a late first, and that's a no-go for me. I'd be okay sending 2 twos. Probably surprised if that actually works out, but I would do that. Now, would I consider going the opposite direction? If tanking, yeah, I'd be good to move down from those tier 2 guys if I can add a first. If I'm contending, it's a little dicier because I might need that production, and those tier 4 guys are a little shaky on their contender production. So what about tiering down from tier 4 into tier 5? So our tier 4 guys, Addison, Puka, T, Devontae, and Ayuk, and trading down into tier 5. So we haven't talked Jordan Addison yet, and he's probably at the top of my list to try to tier down if I can get a decent plus. Addison's been okay with a 17% target share this year. We're really looking for anything over 20% is good. Anything over 25%, great. Over 30%, you're talking about like a top 5 caliber wide receiver, which is what we saw from Garrett Wilson earlier. So given the lack of dominance within his own team, he's probably living off some fortunate touchdown luck right now. But I will say this, he's on a team that loves to chuck it, so he can probably get away with lower target share for some others. The first thing I'm trying to do with Addison is trade within tiers. So can I trade Addison for any of T, Ayuk, Devontae, or Puka, and maybe get a small plus? Remember, T's about to miss a couple games. Is he on a contender? If you're tanking with Addison, I love this swap. Maybe you can do Addison and a third for T and a contender second. Or another move involving Addison, maybe I take my Addison and kick in a player like Jerome Ford or Romeo Dobbs and get a second. So players that I can't typically trade for a second straight up. So think about it like this, Addison and Dobbs for Ayuk and a 2, or Devontae and a 2. I'd also be trying to see if I could swap Addison for Waddle. It might not happen often, but it's worth trying, and maybe you can kick in at the value of a third. I wouldn't add a second, though. The next move with Addison is trying to trade down, maybe Addison for London in a second. London is a guy that the owners are typically pretty high on, so he might not reflect consensus very well, so it might be a little more difficult. But maybe people are tired of DK Metcalf. Maybe you can move Addison and some junk for DK and 2-2s or second round equivalents. If you listen to the Dynasty Market Watch pod, you know that David Gutierrez is totally out on DK, and I really don't blame him. He made a great case, and it's worth listening to. So I didn't mention much of Puka, Ayuk, or Devontae. You can really sub in the name of any of these guys. That's the whole idea of tiered trading. So maybe you don't have Addison and you have Ayuk. Everything I said for Addison is pretty much applicable. The idea here is that we want to be player agnostic. We don't care about the name. We just want to accrue value, and then we can use that value to build a juggernaut. So I mentioned London and DK from tier 5. So let's start to shift down there. And this is where things do start to muddy up a bit. So to recap, tier 4 was 5 players, wide receivers 11 through 15. So we'll pick up tier 5 with wide receiver 16, which is consisting of 3 young guys, 3 middle-aged guys, and 3 old guys. Now remember, this is my interpretation of consensus. These are not my rankings. So tier 5 has 9 players. I'll list them, but we may not get to all of them. So tier 5's 3 young guys are JSN, Zay Flowers, and Drake London. The 3 middle-aged are DK, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman. And the 3 old wide receivers are Kupp, Keenan Allen, Devontae Adams. So 9 guys total in tier 5. So if I'm tiering back from tier 4 into this tier, it's pretty cut and dry for me. Am I a contender or am I a rebuilder? If I'm a contender and I can trade back from tier 4 for an old guy and get a 1-2 swap, that'd be awesome. So maybe it's Addison and a 2 for Kupp and a first. If I'm contending and I'm tiering back from tier 4, which was Addison, Ayuk, Puka, Devontae, or T, and moving into the old point scoring group, I'm probably wanting a couple seconds on top. 1 second probably wouldn't do the trick for me. I'd really like to get some sort of first second swap ideally. Or if I'm really shoving my chips, maybe I can get a second and an Aaron Jones type. If you're rebuilding, another tier back might be trading Devontae Smith and tiering into the young guy grouping. So can I move Devontae for JSN and 2-2s? Maybe it's just 1-2. I'd be okay with that. We talked Drake London earlier, and I love tiering back into him. He'd easily be my favorite choice. So maybe you see the writing on the wall and your team is falling apart and you have Stephon Diggs. Maybe you go Diggs and a second for London and a first. Or maybe you got to send Diggs and 2-2s. The tier 5 medium age guys are DJ Moore, DK, and Pittman. And I really am feeling like these guys are sort of in no man's land. They aren't going out of their way to help you this year, and they aren't really accruing any value. So if I have them, I'm trying to trade within tier and get maybe an old guy on a contender or a young guy on a rebuild. So a trade I recently made on a tank team was DK and a second for Josh Downs and a first. That's the sort of trade I'm trying to make. Of course, trading within the tier is pretty desirable. So if I can take my DJ Moore and trade it for Kupp or Adams, and maybe even get a little value on top, that'd be great. Maybe it's DJ Moore and the wide receiver 40 for Kupp and the wide receiver 30. Just a small boost. All right, so that's tier 4 and 5, which consists of 14 wide receivers from wide receiver 11 through 24. Hope you enjoyed, and I'm interested to get any feedback or how I can make this more useful. Apply in the comments or slide in the DMs. Let me know. Go check out the Dynasty Market Watch podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find it pinned on my Twitter at DynastySFlex. I'm Todd. Trade for T. Thanks for listening.
Yesterday's price is not today's price.